April 18, 1942, North Pacific Ocean. The dawn broke cold and gray over the restless Pacific. Waves struck the steel hull of the USS Hornet with dull, rhythmic thunder, each crash echoing through the carrier's narrow corridors. Salt spray mixed with jet fuel. Men shouted above the roar of the sea, their voices sharp against the wind. On the flight deck, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers stood lined like waiting giants, squat, powerful, unfamiliar shapes on a ship built for fighters. Their olive-drab bodies glistened under the morning rain. Engines coughed, then roared to life, one after another, shaking the deck. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the first plane. He looked ahead, just 467 feet of deck before open water. Beyond that, 650 miles of empty ocean separated him from the coast of Japan. It was a one-way flight. Far to the west, the Empire of Japan slept in full safety. No foreign bomb had ever fallen on its cities. The thought of American planes reaching Tokyo seemed impossible. But impossibility was about to take flight. As Doolittle signaled his crew and pushed the throttles forward, the Hornet shuddered beneath the weight of destiny. The war's tide had not yet turned, but that morning the Pacific began to whisper of change. The world after Pearl Harbor, December 1941, April 1942. The world was burning. By early 1942, the Axis powers stood triumphant across continents. In Europe, Hitler's armies had swallowed Poland, France, and much of the Soviet frontier. In the Pacific, Japan, newly awakened by its own imperial dreams, had struck with ferocity unseen in modern war. On December 7, 1941, the calm waters of Pearl Harbor became a graveyard of steel. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, once the shield of American strength, lay shattered beneath black columns of smoke. 8 battleships were hit. More than 2,400 Americans lay dead. In a single morning, isolationism drowned in the oil-slicked waters of Hawaii. The Japanese empire surged outward in every direction. Hong Kong fell, Manila surrendered. The Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and Burma collapsed under lightning campaigns. The Pacific became a Japanese lake, stretching from the shores of China to the islands near Australia. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a grim map. The nation was furious, humiliated, desperate for retribution, but the United States had little ability to strike back. Its army was small, its air force scattered, and its navy crippled. The enemy seemed far beyond reach. The American public demanded action. Newspapers screamed for vengeance, avenge Pearl Harbor, but military leaders knew the bitter truth. Japan's home islands lay protected by thousands of miles of ocean, ringed by radar stations, warships, and aircraft. Any attempt to bomb Tokyo seemed suicidal. Yet Roosevelt wanted something symbolic, something that would hit the Japanese heart and prove to both friend and foe that America was not broken. In early January 1942, an idea began to take shape in the corridors of the War Department, reckless, improbable, but thrilling in its audacity. Could American bombers, too large for any carrier deck, be launched from the sea and strike the Japanese capital itself? The challenge found its champion in Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a man known not only as a brilliant pilot and engineer, but as a gambler with nerves of steel. Doolittle, a veteran aviator, test pilot, and aeronautical pioneer, listened to the proposal with quiet focus. To him, it was impossible and therefore irresistible. He knew the risks: long range, no chance of return, uncertain rescue in enemy or Chinese territory. But he also knew what the nation needed: a spark of hope. He volunteered without hesitation. Within weeks, the top-secret plan began to take form, codenamed Special Aviation Project No. 1. Its goal: to launch twin-engine bombers from a U.S. Navy carrier, strike key Japanese cities, and continue westward to land in China. No mission like it had ever been attempted. In hidden hangars and quiet offices, engineers began asking questions that had never been asked before. How to make a bomber fly off a short deck. How much fuel would be needed to cross an ocean. And how many men would be willing to take off, knowing they might never return. Every solution would have to be invented, every risk accepted. From this crucible of urgency and imagination, the Doolittle raid was born. And as the plans grew bolder, so too did the stakes, for this mission was not only a strike at Japan, but a test of American will. Training, preparation, and the long voyage toward destiny. At Eglin Field, Florida, winter winds swept across the pine forests as a small group of volunteer crews arrived under strict secrecy. 80 men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and engineers, all handpicked from the 17th Bomb Group. None yet knew the full mission, only that it would be dangerous. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle greeted them with his characteristic calm. He told them little, but his confidence was magnetic. "We'll be flying off a carrier," he finally admitted. The room went silent. No one had ever flown a medium bomber from a carrier before. The men began training immediately. Runways were marked at just 467 feet, matching the length of a carrier's flight deck. Day after day, they practiced short takeoffs, heavy with fuel, learning to lift off just above the treetops. Every mistake could mean death. At nearby airfields, mechanics worked to transform the B-25 Mitchell into something new, lighter, longer-legged, and adapted for sea launch. Armor plating and defensive guns were stripped out. Extra fuel tanks were installed, extending range to nearly 2,400 miles. The lower gun turret was removed entirely, replaced by wooden dummies to save weight. Navigation maps were hand-drawn. Targets included Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, the industrial heart of Japan. Meanwhile, Admiral William F. Bull Halsey, commanding the Pacific Carrier Task Force, coordinated with Doolittle's team. The plan was daring in its simplicity. The USS Hornet would carry 16 B-25s on its deck. The USS Enterprise, with its own fighter squadrons, would escort it across the northern Pacific. The combined fleet would sail to within 500 miles of Japan, close enough for the bombers to strike, and then continue west toward airfields in Free China. On April 1, 1942, the task force departed from San Francisco under complete radio silence. The sight of the giant bombers lashed to the deck of the Hornet stunned even the sailors who had not been briefed. Few believed it could work. Days passed in tense monotony as the ships plowed through cold Pacific waters. Crews spent their time checking maps, practicing compass readings, and memorizing emergency procedures. The sea was rough, the weather uncertain, but spirits remained high. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the men felt they were taking the war to the enemy. Then came April 18, 1942, the day that changed everything. At dawn, the American task force was spotted by a small Japanese patrol vessel, Nito Maru, more than 600 miles from Japan's coast. The destroyer Nashville quickly opened fire, sinking the craft, but not before it had transmitted a warning to Tokyo. Doolittle and Halsey faced a terrible decision. Launching now meant taking off from nearly 200 miles farther than planned, which meant less fuel and almost no chance of reaching China. Delaying meant certain interception by Japanese forces. Doolittle didn't hesitate. He ordered immediate launch. One by one, the bombers were prepared on the rain-swept deck, tied down as the Hornet pitched violently in the rising waves. Pilots tightened their harnesses, engines roared, and fuel fumes filled the morning air. The mission that had begun as a desperate hope was now reality. 16 bombers, 80 men, a sea that offered no way back. Their course was set toward the heart of Imperial Japan. And as the bombers disappeared into the clouds, they carried with them not only explosives, but the weight of an entire nation's pride. Human, tactical, and technological dimensions. The human angle, courage beyond logic. For the men of the Doolittle raid, courage was not the absence of fear, it was the calm mastery of it. Each of the 80 volunteers had signed up for an operation cloaked in mystery, knowing only that it might be their last. On the deck of the Hornet, moments before takeoff, they shared silent rituals. One man folded a letter to his wife and left it with a sailor. Another stared at a photograph of his newborn child, a few cracked jokes that nobody laughed at. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, 45 years old, already a legend in aviation, walked among them with quiet assurance. To his men, he was more than a commander. He was a symbol of control in chaos. Doolittle knew the odds. He expected to crash, perhaps die, yet he carried himself with a serenity that steadied those around him. In later years, one pilot recalled, "He made us believe that success wasn't just possible, it was inevitable." The crews had trained for this moment for months, perfecting every detail, from takeoff angles to fuel calculations. They were scientists, warriors, and dreamers combined, bound by a single shared purpose, to strike the enemy who believed they were untouchable. Each man faced not just physical danger, but emotional weight, to avenge comrades lost at Pearl Harbor, to prove that their country still had fight left. For them, the flight ahead wasn't just a mission, it was redemption in motion. The tactical angle, a strike born of desperation and genius. The raid was an act of calculated recklessness, tactically impossible by the standards of 1942 military aviation. But Doolittle and his planners turned desperation into innovation. Japan's empire stretched far across the Pacific, defended by long-range naval patrols and fighter bases. No American carrier could approach undetected. No land-based bomber had the range to reach Tokyo and return. The idea of launching bombers from a carrier was so unorthodox that Japanese strategists never considered it possible, a blind spot the Americans would exploit. Each carried only a small payload, 4 500-pound bombs, 2 high-explosive, 2 incendiary. The objective wasn't mass destruction. It was psychological, to prove that Japan's cities were vulnerable, that the war could reach their own streets. The task force itself was small but formidable. The aircraft carriers USS Hornet, CV-8, and USS Enterprise, CV-6. 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers. Nearly 16,000 men, supporting 16 bombers. Every precaution had been taken. The route crossed the northern Pacific, where foul weather and rough seas would conceal the fleet. Communications were tightly controlled. If discovered too early, the operation would be aborted. When the Japanese picket boats spotted them, all tactical plans dissolved into urgency. Halsey's decision to launch early was a gamble, but it preserved the mission. The task force turned back immediately after takeoff, heading eastward at full speed to avoid counterattack. Tactically, the raid achieved something far greater than its modest firepower. It shattered the illusion of Japan's invulnerability and forced the Imperial Navy to reconsider its entire defensive perimeter. It was the art of war executed as a message, one that would echo all the way to Midway. The technological angle, reinventing the impossible. The success of the raid depended not on brute force, but on ingenuity. The North American B-25B Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber, had never been intended for carrier operations. It was too large, too heavy, and required over 1,200 feet for a standard takeoff. So Doolittle's engineers reimagined it. They stripped the aircraft to the bone, removing turrets, radios, and non-essential armor. A collapsible fuel bladder was added to the bomb bay. The Norden bombsight, top-secret technology, was replaced with a simpler handmade model to prevent capture. Propellers were adjusted for low-speed torque. Pilots trained to yank their planes off the deck just before stalling, skimming the ocean before climbing to altitude. Every inch of the aircraft was repurposed for range. Crews learned how to fly at low altitudes to avoid radar detection, how to climb only at the last moment before releasing bombs, and how to conserve fuel for the desperate push toward China. In effect, the B-25 became a hybrid, part naval aircraft, part long-range raider. What made it extraordinary wasn't the machine itself, but the mindset behind it. The Doolittle raid was less a triumph of technology than a triumph of adaptation, proof that innovation under pressure could overcome even the most rigid limitations. And as those bombers thundered off the Hornet's deck, the line between the possible and the impossible was forever blurred. The stage was set. 16 aircraft were now airborne, streaking low over the gray Pacific, toward a nation that believed itself untouchable. Each mile closed the gap between vengeance and history. Enemy perspective, moral awakening, and leadership consequences. The enemy perspective, the day Japan's sky was broken. For months after Pearl Harbor, Japan moved through the Pacific like a force of nature. Its armies conquered territories with frightening speed. Tokyo newspapers boasted that the emperor's realm was protected by a divine wind, the kamikaze spirit reborn from ancient legend. The Japanese people believed no enemy could reach their sacred homeland. On the morning of April 18, 1942, that illusion shattered. At around noon, air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo. Few citizens recognized the sound. At first some thought it a drill. Then, from the cloudy sky came the deep hum of engines, not the familiar tone of Japanese planes, but something heavier, alien. 5 American B-25s swept over the city at treetop height, engines screaming, silver bellies glinting through the haze. The first bombs fell on the Nakajima Aircraft Works, one of Tokyo's largest military factories. Others struck oil depots, docks, and power stations. Fires spread fast through wooden districts. Civilians fled into the streets, stunned that foreign aircraft had reached their capital. Anti-aircraft gunners fired wildly, uncoordinated and confused. Few hits were recorded. Most Japanese pilots were too far away to respond. Within 20 minutes, it was over. The bombers vanished eastward into the clouds, leaving behind a city still in disbelief. In military terms, the damage was minor. But psychologically, it was devastating. For the first time in its history, Japan had been struck from the sky. The war that had seemed so distant, so certain, had suddenly arrived at its doorstep. A senior officer later confessed, "The American raid did little physical harm, but it burned our pride. That was far worse." The shock ran deep through Japan's military hierarchy. If bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could do so again, and perhaps in greater numbers. The myth of the invincible empire had cracked. The moral and psychological angle, a nation awakened. Back in the United States, the Doolittle raid was more than a military action. It was an act of moral resurrection. News of the attack reached Washington cautiously at first, shrouded in secrecy for fear of Japanese reprisals against Chinese civilians. But once the operation became known, the effect was electric. America had been reeling since Pearl Harbor. Its people had endured months of defeat, Wake Island, Bataan, Corregidor. Confidence was fading. But now, for the first time, the headlines changed. Tokyo bombed. Crowds cheered in the streets. Newspapers called the raiders heroes of the impossible. Even Roosevelt, smiling slightly during a press conference, quipped that the bombers had come from Shangri-La, a mythical place from James Hilton's Lost Horizon. The mystery added legend to victory. Morale soared, war bonds rose, the belief that Japan was untouchable vanished. For the Japanese, the effect was the opposite. The raid was seen as a humiliation, a failure of the military to protect the emperor's home. Civilian confidence faltered. Anger turned inward, toward commanders, intelligence services, and anyone suspected of failure. The psychological ripples reached deep into strategy. Japan's leaders began to question their defensive line, that vast arc of conquered islands meant to shield the homeland. If the Americans could strike Tokyo this early in the war, what would they do once their full might was unleashed? This was the moment when Japan's confidence shifted, from triumphant expansion to uneasy vigilance. The leadership consequences, seeds of Midway. The Doolittle raid did not just sting Japan's pride, it reshaped its grand strategy. In the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito demanded answers. The Navy's top command, already divided between cautious defenders and aggressive expansionists, now turned their anger into determination. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, took the raid personally. He had promised the emperor that America would be too broken to strike back for at least a year. Now, barely 4 months after Pearl Harbor, American bombers had flown over the capital itself. Yamamoto was humiliated, yet also clear-eyed. He understood the Americans had acted out of desperation, but he feared what it symbolized, their industrial and emotional awakening. To restore confidence and eliminate future threats, Yamamoto pushed for a new offensive, one that would lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a decisive battle. His target, Midway Atoll, a small but strategic outpost in the Central Pacific. There he planned to destroy America's carrier force once and for all, reasserting Japanese dominance. But that decision, born from pride and shock, would lead Japan directly into disaster just 2 months later. The Doolittle raid had achieved something far greater than its modest physical results. It had provoked the enemy into overreach. In the calm after the fires, Japan began preparing for its most ambitious naval battle, unaware that the seeds of its defeat had just been sown by 16 bombers and 80 men. The launch and the bombing of Japan. The morning of April 18, 1942, arrived with grey skies and wind-torn seas. The Hornet pitched heavily in the swell, its bow plunging into cold Pacific waves. Sheets of rain swept across the flight deck, reducing visibility to mere yards. The alarm had sounded hours earlier, enemy vessels sighted. The fleet's secrecy was broken. Doolittle, standing in the ready room with his flight crews, heard the coded report through static. Picket boat destroyed, but message likely sent. The risk had doubled. Japan now knew something or someone was coming. Admiral Halsey turned to Doolittle. "Launch them all," he ordered. "Good luck and God bless you." It was 8:20 hours. The ships were still 650 nautical miles from Japan, 200 miles farther than planned, but there was no other choice. On the Hornet's deck, sailors battled wind and spray as they rolled the first bomber into position. Each of the 16 aircraft had been lashed down since San Francisco. Now, one by one, they were unchained, engines coughing to life. Crewmen leaned into the gale, holding chocks beneath wheels slick with rain. The deck tilted steeply with every wave. Men had to time the release precisely. Too soon, and the plane would drop into the sea. Too late, and it would run out of deck. At 8:20, Doolittle climbed into his B-25, number 42344, codenamed First in Formation. He strapped in, adjusted his goggles, and nodded to his co-pilot, LT Richard Cole. The engines roared to full power, the propellers carving mist from the air. The signal flag dropped. Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber lunged forward, straining against gravity. The Hornet's bow rose and fell beneath it, the ocean yawning ahead. For seconds, it seemed impossible, too short, too heavy. Then, as the carrier pitched upward, Doolittle pulled back on the control column. The plane lifted free, wheels brushing the whitecaps, and clawed into the low clouds. Aboard the Hornet, sailors erupted in cheers. It could be done. One after another, 15 more bombers followed, each launch a ballet of danger and precision. Some barely cleared the deck, others dipped so low that salt water sprayed their windshields before they climbed again. The last aircraft lifted off at 9:20, vanishing into the gray horizon. The ships turned east, racing to safety. For the men in the air, the world ahead was only wind, compass, and sky. They flew in radio silence, hugging the waves at altitudes as low as 200 feet to avoid detection. The Pacific stretched endlessly, featureless and gray. Occasionally, a Japanese fishing boat appeared below. Each time, the crews gripped their weapons, ready for the alarm. Hours passed, then faint outlines of land appeared, the coast of Japan. Doolittle's plane was first to arrive. Beneath him, the vast sprawl of Tokyo shimmered through clouds. He climbed to 1,500 feet, aligned his bomb sight, and released 4 500-pound bombs in sequence. Explosions rippled across the Nakajima aircraft works and nearby oil storage tanks. Fire bloomed orange against the industrial skyline. Smoke curled into the sky, the first American bombs to strike the Japanese homeland. Moments later, another wave hit Yokohama, targeting steel plants and dockyards. Others bombed Nagoya, destroying aircraft assembly lines and power facilities. Still others attacked Kobe and Osaka, igniting warehouses and refineries. Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but their aim was poor. Pilots zigzagged through bursts of black smoke and tracer fire, dropping to rooftop level. One crew watched bullets rip through their fuselage, but kept course. Another narrowly avoided colliding with a radio tower. For 20 minutes, chaos gripped Japan's cities. Civilians ran through narrow streets, terrified and bewildered. Schools and factories emptied. Air raid sirens wailed, late, uncertain, almost disbelieving. The damage was light compared to later bombings, but the symbolism was immense. Tokyo, the heart of the empire, was burning. After the final bombs fell, the aircraft turned westward, engines groaning under the strain of distance and dwindling fuel. Below them lay 1,000 miles of ocean, occupied territory, and mountains. The plan was to reach free China, but every pilot knew the truth. Few would make it that far. The raid had succeeded. Now came the hardest part, survival. Over the cold waters of the East China Sea, as the last bomb bay doors closed and the roar of engines struggled against the wind, the Doolittle raid was already transforming from a tactical strike into a psychological weapon of immeasurable power. The last few crews fought to keep their planes airborne. Low on fuel, battered by weather, and with almost no navigational references, many faced an impossible choice: ditch at sea or risk a crash landing in China. One by one, the aircraft sputtered out of fuel. Crews braced for impact. Lieutenant Robert Height's plane went down near Jiangxi province. Captain Ted Lawson's crew, flying the ruptured duck, crash-landed along the Chinese coast. Lawson was thrown through the windshield, nearly losing his jaw. Others parachuted into dark forests, landing miles apart, hunted by Japanese patrols that quickly mobilized. The Japanese army, already stationed in large parts of China, launched brutal reprisals. They were enraged that the American devils had humiliated the emperor's capital. Entire villages suspected of aiding the Airmen were wiped out. Estimates suggest over 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in the following months, an atrocity driven by vengeance and shock. Of the 80 American raiders, 69 survived the flight, 8 were captured, and 3 were executed after mock trials by Japanese military courts. One died in captivity, enduring months of starvation and torture. Yet in the middle of this chaos, one simple truth emerged. The Doolittle raid had achieved what no Allied propaganda or battle had yet managed. It pierced the illusion of Japanese invulnerability. Tokyo's military command gathered in emergency councils. Army and Navy officers traded accusations. How had the Americans reached Japan undetected? How could a fleet approach their coasts without warning? Confidence turned into fear, fear that the homeland, long thought protected by the vast Pacific, was not untouchable. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, both recognized the deeper implication. Japan's defensive perimeter, the string of islands and ocean control lines, was far too thin. Yamamoto understood immediately: if the Americans could strike once, they would strike again. Harder, deeper. That realization triggered a strategic gamble. Within weeks, Yamamoto finalized plans for Operation MI, the invasion of Midway Atoll. His goal was to draw out the American carriers, annihilate them in one decisive battle, and secure Japan's Pacific dominance before the U.S. industrial machine could fully awaken. The Doolittle raid, though small in material damage, directly shaped this decision. It forced Japan into offense again, pushing it toward what would become the most significant naval battle of the Pacific War. In the United States, the raid had the opposite effect. It electrified a demoralized nation still recovering from Pearl Harbor. The news, cautiously released by the U.S. War Department, declared that American bombers had struck Tokyo. Crowds filled streets. Newspapers ran bold headlines, "Tokyo bombed," and Yank airmen hit back. President Roosevelt, asked where the bombers had launched from, smiled and cryptically told reporters, "From Shangri-La," referencing the mythical paradise from a popular novel. The mystery only deepened the legend. Back in the Pacific, Doolittle himself believed the mission had failed. After crash landing in China, rescued by local partisans, he confessed to his crew that he expected to be court-martialed. The damage seemed too minor for the cost, but when he returned home, he was met not with reprimand, but with the Medal of Honor awarded personally by Roosevelt. The operation's code name, once secret, became a symbol. The Doolittle raid stood for defiance, proof that even a wounded America could still strike. In Tokyo, however, the raid had planted something far more consequential: doubt. For the first time since the war began, Japanese civilians experienced the fear they had long inflicted on others. Sirens, blackouts, and military drills became part of daily life. The war was no longer a distant enterprise of conquest, it was at their doorstep. Yamamoto's pride was wounded, but his mind remained coldly strategic. He ordered a full-scale reassessment of Japan's defenses. The home islands would be ringed by radar stations and patrol routes. The Navy would hunt relentlessly for the American carriers responsible, but Yamamoto knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning. For Japan, the Doolittle raid was a slap that turned into a strategic earthquake. For America, it was a spark in the darkness, the signal that the tide, though not yet turning, could. And that spark would soon ignite the greatest carrier confrontation in naval history, a clash born directly from the shock Tokyo suffered in April 1942. Because from the fires over Tokyo came the flames of Midway. In the weeks following the Doolittle raid, Japan's war cabinet was thrown into turmoil. The shock of American bombers reaching Tokyo tore through every level of military command. For a nation that had prided itself on being the sword of the Pacific, it was an unthinkable humiliation. Tokyo civilians, once confident in their distance from the war's front lines, had seen flames and falling debris in their own streets. Panic spread faster than the fires the B-25s had left behind. Air raid sirens echoed across Japan for days afterward, even when no enemy planes were in sight. Rumors spread of larger American fleets lurking in the Pacific. The illusion of absolute safety was gone. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, known for his calculated calm, took the blow personally. He had long warned Japan's leadership that a prolonged war against the United States would be disastrous, that America's industrial power was vast, its people resilient, and its revenge inevitable. Now, with the Doolittle raid, his prediction had taken its first tangible form. In a series of urgent meetings at the Imperial General Headquarters, Yamamoto argued that Japan must strike back decisively. "We must draw out their carriers," he told his staff, "and destroy them before they gather strength." His plan, Operation MI, was to lure the Americans into a trap at Midway Atoll. It was a bold move, intended to finish what Pearl Harbor had begun. The Doolittle raid thus set off a chain reaction. The very act meant to demoralize Japan instead pushed its navy into one of the riskiest gambles of the entire war. Yamamoto's confidence in a decisive battle would cost him dearly just months later. But before Midway, another tragedy unfolded, far away from the Pacific Ocean, deep in the Chinese countryside. The 8 captured Doolittle raiders were moved from one military prison to another, interrogated, beaten, and starved. In October 1942, 3 Lieutenants Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were executed by firing squad after a mock trial. A 4th, Lieutenant Nielsen, died in captivity from starvation. The remaining 4 endured years of imprisonment, surviving until their liberation in 1945. Their fate was not known to the American public at the time. To the outside world, the Doolittle raiders were heroes, symbols of American resilience. Their photographs were printed on posters, and their names were whispered like legends in factories and shipyards. Meanwhile, in occupied China, Japanese retaliation reached unimaginable cruelty. Believing Chinese villagers had helped the downed airmen, the Imperial Army launched massive punitive campaigns. Entire towns were burned. Civilians were executed by the tens of thousands. Crops and livestock were destroyed. Historians later estimated that over 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in these reprisals, a tragic echo of how a single act of war can ripple into human catastrophe. In the United States, however, the raid's psychological effect was profound. Until April 1942, America had endured a series of defeats: Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines. The Doolittle raid was the first flicker of triumph. It didn't destroy Japan's war machine, but it shattered the sense of despair that had gripped the American public. Recruitment surged, war bond sales soared, newspapers ran emotional headlines: Tokyo gets a taste of its own medicine. Even across allied nations, from London to Moscow, the raid symbolized hope. It proved that the Axis powers could be hit, that they could bleed. For Doolittle himself, what began as a desperate gamble became his defining moment. Upon returning home, he expected disgrace. Instead, he was summoned to the White House, where President Franklin D. Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor. Standing beside the president, Doolittle looked stunned, still nursing guilt for the lives lost. Roosevelt smiled and said, "You've done more than hit Tokyo, Jimmy. You've lifted a nation." In Japan, however, the air had changed. The Doolittle raid had exposed not only physical vulnerability, but psychological weakness. For the first time, the Japanese high command began to understand what they were truly up against, not just a military opponent, but a civilization awakening to war. And in that realization, the seeds of the next decisive encounter were already being sown, one that would determine the fate of the Pacific itself. In the months that followed the Doolittle raid, the psychological tremors it caused began to reshape the Pacific War in ways few could have predicted. For the Japanese military, the raid was more than a surprise. It was a direct assault on national pride. The emperor's capital had been bombed. The public's confidence in the invincibility of the Imperial Navy, the shield of Japan, was shaken. Leaders in Tokyo now demanded swift redemption. Every decision in the following months, every meeting at the Imperial General Headquarters, carried a shadow. The Americans had struck first. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, perhaps more than any other figure, internalized this humiliation. The Doolittle raid haunted him. He could not allow another American strike to reach the homeland. His strategy shifted entirely, from cautious expansion to decisive confrontation. In May 1942, he set the plan in motion: Operation MI, the assault on Midway Atoll. Yamamoto's intelligence believed the U.S. Navy was weakened, still recovering from Pearl Harbor. He assumed the American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, would rush to defend Midway. That's exactly what he wanted. There, far from American shores, he would crush them and regain Japan's psychological dominance. But Yamamoto was wrong. The Americans had broken Japan's naval codes. They knew his plan. When the fleets met off Midway in June 1942, it was not the trap Yamamoto had envisioned, it was his own undoing. In a single morning of combat, Japan lost 4 frontline aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, the same 4 that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of elite pilots were lost, and Japan's carrier strength never recovered. Midway was not only a strategic defeat, it was the moment Japan's offensive momentum ended. And the roots of that battle, the chain of reactions that brought Yamamoto to risk everything, traced back to one event: the Doolittle raid. In Washington, analysts quickly understood the indirect victory they had achieved. By forcing Japan to overreach, the raid had set the stage for Midway's decisive turnaround. What began as a symbolic strike had become the pivot point of the Pacific War. For the men who flew the mission, the aftermath was deeply personal. Many struggled with what they had endured in China: the loss of comrades, the devastation inflicted on Chinese civilians, and the moral weight of their mission. Yet, history remembered them not as destroyers, but as the spark that awakened an entire nation. In later interviews, General Doolittle often reflected with humility. "It wasn't the damage we did that mattered, it was what it did to the spirit of our people." And indeed, that spirit would go on to fuel the massive industrial and military mobilization that followed. American shipyards, factories, and training schools accelerated production at unprecedented speed. Within 2 years, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would become the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Japan, on the other hand, began its long retreat. After Midway, its strategy shifted from conquest to desperate defense. Resources dwindled, confidence eroded. The Doolittle raid, once dismissed as a pinprick attack, had started the unraveling of an empire built on arrogance and illusion. In China, stories of the American airmen who fell from the sky became legends of courage. Villagers who had risked their lives to help them were remembered as silent heroes. Decades later, survivors of the raid returned to China to honor those who had died protecting them. In their eyes, the Doolittle raid was not just an American story, it was a shared human one. By 1945, when Japan finally lay in ruins and the emperor spoke words of surrender, the echo of those first explosions over Tokyo still lingered in memory. It was a reminder of how a handful of men, flying 16 bombers on a one-way mission, had changed the trajectory of a world war. From the decks of the Hornet to the streets of Tokyo, from the rice fields of China to the command rooms of Pearl Harbor, the Doolittle raid had reshaped minds, hearts, and destinies. The raid was over, but its message endured. No nation is untouchable, and no empire is invincible. And as the dust of war began to settle, history would remember this moment not for its scale, but for its signal, the signal that America's fight had only just begun. The Doolittle raid was not the largest battle, nor the deadliest, but its significance transcended numbers and tonnage. 16 bombers, 80 men, and a single aircraft carrier had challenged an empire and reshaped the psychology of a global conflict. In a single morning, Tokyo burned, and the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. The empire had been forced to confront a reality it had long denied. Across the ocean, a nation thought broken was still capable of striking with precision, audacity, and courage. The shock rippled through strategy rooms, council chambers, and family homes alike, altering decisions and destinies. Midway, the pivotal battle that followed, was a direct consequence of that awakening. For the men who flew, the raid demanded more than skill. It demanded resolve in the face of almost certain death. It demanded trust in one another, in leadership, and in a plan that defied conventional logic. Their bravery became emblematic not only of American tenacity, but of a universal truth. Courage often thrives where hope is scarce. Technologically, the raid forced innovation. The B-25 Mitchell, redesigned and adapted, became a symbol of ingenuity under pressure. The operation demonstrated that limitations, whether of machines, geography, or human endurance, could be overcome when necessity demanded it. Yet the raid also left a shadow. The reprisals against Chinese civilians, the deaths of captured airmen, and the destruction caused in the wake of this daring act revealed war's unforgiving human cost. Heroism and tragedy were inseparable. History remembers the Doolittle raid as more than a military action. It was a statement: America would fight. The fight was just beginning. Across oceans, across islands, across the hearts of nations, that day in April 1942 became a beacon of defiance and a turning point in the Pacific. From the shaking decks of the Hornet, to the fiery streets of Tokyo, to the mountains of China, the raid's resonance endured. It was proof that the courage of a few can ignite the resolve of many, and that even in the darkest hour, the spark of determination can alter the course of history. The Doolittle raid was more than bombs falling from the sky. It was the first whisper of America's awakening, the signal that the tide of war was only beginning to turn.